Alright, YouTube, Occult Video 70, the Codex Gigas. Somebody actually wanted me to make a video on this topic. I said, oh, it does fit in with like literary history, which is something I'm interested in. This specific work, of course, it's a medieval text. That is true. It's not like a modern. Nobody questions its authenticity as a medieval text. It's an illuminated manuscript. It's extremely long. It's considerable in size. Codex Gigas, literally great text or large text. It's enormous, and apparently, and I think this is sensible, it would have taken many years for one individual to have actually written it. They have performed handwriting analysis on the actual inscriptions. Apparently, it probably was written by just one person. It might have taken them 10, 20, 30 years to do this, and that's just it would have taken arguably longer to actually make the illustrations than to actually write the document. There's no real change in the handwriting across all of its pages. Now, it's called sometimes the Devil's Bible because of a story. The backstory, it's similar to the Grand Grimoire sort of mythology that goes along with the actual text. That is, the idea is that there was a monk, he had broken his vows, they were going to wall him up in the monastery, sort of trap him there till he died. I don't know, starve him to death or just keep him there and feed him through a hole in the floor or something. And in order to escape this punishment, he said, oh, well, I'll write a book containing all human knowledge, and thus it will atone for my sins. It'll be like the greatest book ever. So they let him do this, and he said, oh, I'd do it in a single night. Then around midnight, he says, oh, well, I can't do this on my own, because it's impossible. And so what ended up happening is he sold his soul to the devil or some sort of demon he partnered with that helped him write this in a single night. And that's the explanation is, well, it wasn't written over a period of time. It was written all at once. Now, I think the real thing that ended up happening is I think that some monk, and monks tended around that time to be the most literate segment of the European population, they had the time for learning. They would have been versed in Latin and English generally. If they're in England, or Latin and some other language elsewhere, they would have been skilled with literature. They would have studied handwriting extensively. They had access to the ink and the pages. And this is the sort of thing. They also brewed a lot of ale, which is actually funny. Learning and beer were the hallmarks of a monastic lifestyle in the medieval era. It's actually quite astounding that humanity survived for all those years. And if it weren't for Christian monks, the only wise Christians of the era, most of this knowledge probably would have been branded heretical and destroyed. The Codex Gigas, though, mostly it's a Bible. Not the Devil's Bible, but literally just a Christian Bible. The reason why people have ruminated upon it as having something to do with the devil is they probably couldn't believe that a single scribe had so perfectly written such a massive manuscript over time. Most people back in those days were completely illiterate and couldn't even write their own name. The more literate amongst them, generally, it would have been much more slow a process. Now, supposedly the actual author of this work was Herman the Recluse, sort of a figure within this monastic tradition, sort of kept to himself and just worked on, I guess, inscribing holy texts and so forth. So, if this person was doing this not just like other monks a few hours a day, but was doing it literally all day, he probably got pretty good at it, and in a fairly short time, he probably was going much more quickly than all of the other monks. So maybe it wouldn't have taken actually 5 years just to do the calligraphy. Maybe it only took him 3 or 4 years, and maybe he was just really good at art and stuff. Another thing is that the illustration of the devil on one of the pages is substantially darker than the rest of the text. Now, vellum, which is what it's written on, darkens over time with exposure. What this means is that this particular page has been on display more. It's been open to this page more. Probably people by candlelight were studying it for hours and thought that it was some great, evil, monstrous thing. You got to realize most of the people that would have potentially encountered this text, even up through the end of the Renaissance, were themselves illiterate. They had no idea what the book was about. Only monks and some of the wealthy literate elite and maybe a few of the nobles and like mercantile class would have actually been capable of reading anything, and who's to say that they were able to read this particular script? It would have been difficult for them, so naturally a mythology sprung up around it. But what it literally is at some point in the medieval period, some monk was largely left alone to their own devices for a period of some years or possibly decades, wrote this enormous text, heavily illustrated it, did a really good job making sure everything was absolutely perfect, and did create one of the gems of the medieval era as far as actual books go. Of course, back then they didn't have the printing press. It had to be done by hand. If you wanted to replicate a book or a scroll or something, you had to write it all out completely yourself. And it's a little bit more difficult than typing it on a computer or on a typewriter, or printing, 100 copies in a week of something using even the early manual presses that they had back in the 1400s, so the Gutenberg era. It would be very difficult. But it's not the devil's Bible. The fact that Satan is illustrated here on a massive page and that page is darker is evidence that people were interested in that particular illustration. The idea that a monk sold his soul to the devil and wrote the whole thing in a single night, no, I'm thinking that's probably not the case. Belief in the devil aside, it wouldn't make sense. It makes more sense to say a scribe did this over a course of time. The fact that the handwriting doesn't really change perhaps indicates that this was a particularly skilled individual. We might even think of it as possibly a savant. What if somebody was entered into the monastic lifestyle because some aspects of their behavior were seen as too simple, too crude, they were mentally challenged in some way. They ended up getting put in a monastery, perhaps as an embarrassment to some noble family, and it turns out that actually, as far as the languages go, they were exceptionally skilled. We might be seeing somebody who literally was like autistic and had difficulty doing many things, but as far as writing was both absorbed with doing it, wanted, maybe even reacted violently if taken away from their writing for any specific period of time other than to eat or shit or something like that. You could have someone who has literally a violent outburst when they're taken away from this book, who became perhaps the most literate person of their generation. You could envision such a scenario, but the work, as far as calling it the Devil's Bible, the only reason that that's done is because of this one particular illustration of the devil, as well as the backstory. But the backstory was probably formed when people couldn't imagine that any single scribe was actually capable of doing this. Additionally, we might think the monastery started such a rumor. We might think that perhaps in this age, where people were often blamed for witchery, perhaps some inquisitor or something came around, wondered how this book was constructed, said, well, this has quite a few pictures of like demonic stuff in it, and it's all in the same handwriting. You're telling me one person wrote it. How can that possibly be? Because they were illiterate too, and they wouldn't have been able to believe it. They're used to, if they see anything that's written in that era, tends to be like 30 or 40 pages long, and that's basically the extent of it. You look at most of these illuminated manuscripts, half of it's just illustration. There might only be 20 or 30 total paragraphs of actual text, because the only audience capable of reading such a thing maybe didn't want really long works that they then were commanded to copy by hand. It would have been rather difficult. The entire monastery working in tandem would probably take them a week just to create a single copy of a halfway decent work that's like 100 pages long. Imagine how long it would have taken them, illustrations and all, to replicate the Codex Gigas. I think what ended up happening is perhaps the monastery started that rumor themselves, either to lend sort of a divine spectacle to the work, or to justify how it had been manufactured to people who were incredulous and didn't believe that one person who just was really focused on writing managed to actually do it in a single lifetime, because it would have taken a large proportion of a person's lifetime working very long hours at that period. I think the total was 5 years of working nonstop 24 hours a day to replicate the work, assuming that a person was halfway skilled. And even if you cut that down to like 4 years, they still would have taken them 8 years to do the calligraphy alone, working 12 hours a day. It's a long-ass time for people who often died in their 50s or 60s of common diseases and tended not to live into their 70s or 80s. This would have been a person who started out probably fairly young, had the knack for literature, had the knack for these languages, and then proceeded to spend a couple of decades potentially doing little other than editing this particular work. So it's an interesting book, but essentially most of its content is just literally a Bible. It has nothing to do with the devil. That's just an illustration. That's about all. Peace out.